I was picturing this fisherman in Hokkaido, northern Japan. For the past year, he's basically been watching his biggest market vanish. His primary catch isn't just seafood, it's high-value scallops destined for China. But then, starting last August, that entire channel just shut down, slammed. The reason? Hundreds of miles south, a nuclear power plant that melted down over a decade ago started releasing treated wastewater into the ocean. His own government, backed by the UN's nuclear watchdog, kept insisting it was perfectly safe, cleaner than standard. But his main customer, China, called it a radioactive threat and banned everything. His scallops, his boat, his entire livelihood, all caught in this massive political and scientific standoff. He was just collateral damage. And then, this past week, the strangest thing happened. The ban, which had been absolute, suddenly cracked open. An order came through. Not for everything and not from everywhere. China would accept his scallops from Hokkaido, but not from 9 other prefectures closer to the plant. And they would only take them if every single shipment now comes with a brand new certificate, a special piece of paper proving or promising that it's clean.
That story, I mean, it feels so specific, so personal to that one fisherman, right? But it's actually the perfect way to frame this huge global issue we've been watching.
Exactly.
What we're really seeing here is this perfect storm, where you've got genuine public health worries, massive international trade flows, and some pretty high stakes geopolitical games all colliding.
It really makes you think about how connected everything is. One decision about wastewater hundreds of miles away and boom.
And watching that whole trade route just shatter like that.
Yeah.
It really highlights how fragile these global supply chains can be sometimes.
Yeah, it's this real tangle of hard science clashing with political moves, and the fallout, well, you measure it in billions of dollars, and who knows how many livelihoods like that fishermen's.
So that's really our mission for this deep dive, isn't it? To try and untangle that whole mess.
Right.
We should probably start with the economic shockwaves, I think. Look at the huge impact this ban had on Japan's fisheries, and maybe how quickly they had to scramble, find new strategies, new markets to sort of mitigate the damage and, hedge against future risks like this.
Okay. And then
we absolutely have to dig in to the science, the arguments, the safety claims, the diplomatic back and forth that eventually somehow led to this partial lifting of the ban. That's crucial.
The science and the diplomacy, yeah. Because of that partial lifting, it's very specific. Hokkaido, yes, others, no.
Exactly. And finally, maybe the hardest part, where we need to look at the whole public perception thing, rebuilding trust. Because you can have all the science in the world, but if consumers are scared...
That trust is everything.
Especially with food. It's the biggest hurdle. So, yeah, assessing that challenge, how they're trying to manage it.
Okay, so, setting the stage. We're looking at the massive, immediate hit to Japan's fisheries, how they tried to diversify away from China, the nitty-gritty of the science and the negotiations that got that partial deal done, and then this huge, ongoing challenge of getting people globally to trust the seafood again after a nuclear scare, even when the official science says it's okay. Right, let's start with the money side. That trade ban, it wasn't like a small disruption. For Japanese seafood, especially those high-end exports like scallops, it was, as you said, a shockwave. An arterial bleed, even.
Yes, staggering is probably the right word for how much they depended on China. I mean, China was easily Japan's biggest single market for seafood.
What were the numbers again?
It's around 22.5% of Japan's total seafood exports by value. But that number doesn't even tell the whole story.
How so?
Because within that 22.5%, it was really dominated by a few specific things. High-value products people really wanted in China, like sea cucumber and especially scallops.
And for scallops, the dependency was almost total, wasn't it, from the export side?
Pretty much, yeah. If you dig into the data, something like over 97% of all the scallops imported into China, not just from Japan, but from anywhere, came from Japan.
Wow, 97%.
So when the GACC, that's the General Administration of Customs in China, announced the suspension, effective August 24, 2023. Well, you can imagine. That basically meant 97% of a huge established supply chain for scallops in China just vanished. Poof, overnight.
It wasn't just lost sales then. It was like the whole structure supporting that industry just collapsed.
For Japanese scallops, absolutely. A structural failure. And what's really interesting, or maybe alarming, is how fast the market reacted, even before the GACC officially shut things down.
Right, people saw it coming.
Exactly. It shows you that sometimes just the anticipation of a risk, especially a geopolitical one, can hit harder than the event itself.
So what happened in the run-up?
Well, if you look at July 2023 data, that's after the discharge plan was announced, but before the ban actually hit, trade was already tanking. Chinese buyers were basically canceling orders left and right.
Smart move for them, I guess. Risky for the Japanese suppliers.
Terribly risky. Fresh bluefin tuna imports, they fell 47% year on year just in July. And fresh scallops, that was even worse. A 98% plummet compared to the year before.
98%, just like that.
Just like that. Wholesalers, buyers in China, they immediately figured the ban was coming and started looking elsewhere, leaving Japanese companies stuck with docks full of high-value, perishable seafood. Nightmare scenario.
And when you look at the total value lost over the next year, it's not just a dip. It's like that whole market segment just ceased to exist.
It really is like an extinction event for that specific trade flow. Let's put it in context. In 2022, Japan's seafood exports to China were worth about $5.74 billion. That was nearly 3% of all the aquatic products China imported globally.
Okay, so a significant chunk.
A very significant chunk. Okay. Now, look at the period after the ban, say September 2023 to August 2024, the actual trade value. It dropped to something like $332,000.
From $5.74 billion to just over $300,000.
Yeah. It's basically negligible. A multi-billion-dollar market wiped out in 12 months. That shows you the power, the leverage China had, and just how profound that disruption was.
So when a market that big just disappears, I mean, the Japanese government has to step in, right? You've got companies facing bankruptcy, holding tons of stock they suddenly can't sell.
Oh, absolutely. They had no choice. They reacted pretty quickly, setting up an emergency fund.
How much was that?
It ended up totaling $100 billion, which is what, around $670 million US dollars, something like that. It came in two chunks, $20 billion in new aid, plus $80 billion they'd already sort of earmarked.
And what was that money actually for? Just bailouts?
Not exactly bailouts, more like targeted support. It was specifically meant to help the producers on the ground. Things like covering the costs of freezing and storing all that excess stock that was supposed to go to China.
Which must be expensive.
Hugely. And also subsidizing processing costs, maybe retooling products for different markets. Plus, launching campaigns to promote exports to other countries, trying to find new buyers. The immediate goal was just to stop prices completely collapsing and prevent a wave of bankruptcies.
And you mentioned that $100 billion fund was fighting against these really specific local crises, like that company in Aomori.
Precisely. Let's zoom in on that example, Watanabe Suzan, a processing company specializing in scallops near Aomori. Suddenly, they're sitting on 100 tons of frozen scallops.
100 tons?
Yeah, high-quality stuff, already sized and packaged perfectly for the Chinese market. First, just storing that much is a massive headache and cost. Freezer space isn't cheap. And second, they saw the price for their main product just tank, dropping by up to 30% almost immediately.
So the government aid helps with storage fees, maybe, but they still need to find someone to buy 100 tons of scallops meant for a market that no longer exists.
Exactly. That kind of pressure cooker environment, it forces companies to change radically and fast. It becomes diversification by, well, sheer necessity.
It's sink or swim, basically.
It really is the definition of forced modernization, in a way. Japanese officials started aggressively pushing exports to new places. They targeted high-growth areas, Europe, the Middle East, the U.S., and, crucially, Southeast Asia.
That's not easy, is it? You can't just ship scallops meant for China to, say, Europe.
No way. It meant getting processing plants recertified for different standards, changing all the packaging, learning a completely different consumer taste compared to what the huge Chinese market wanted, and freezing and storing the excess. That was just the immediate Band-Aid. Just kicks the problem down the road, hoping either the ban lifts or these new markets somehow absorb all that capacity.
We did see some companies get really agile, though, especially using online sales. It suggests the crisis actually sparked some innovation that might have taken years otherwise.
That digital pivot is a fantastic example, turning a disaster into a domestic opportunity, tapping into that national support.
Like QH.
Yeah, Kiwichi, a seafood processor. They traditionally only sold business to business, huge bulk amounts for export. When that channel just vanished, they switched gears incredibly fast, launched an online store selling directly to Japanese consumers.
Smart.
Very smart. They focus on smaller portions, stuff that looks good to an individual buyer, and they really leaned into that whole buy Japanese, support our fishermen sentiment. And the results were pretty incredible.
How much did they sell?
In just 6 days, they sold $100,000 worth of seafood online. This crisis basically forced them to build a whole new sales channel, learn about consumer marketing things they never did before. It definitely diversified their income streams for the future.
Okay, so Japan is scrambling, innovating, but the shockwave doesn't stop there. China is the world's biggest seafood trader, second biggest importer. Suddenly, they have this huge gap in their supply chain.
Yeah.
That must have created instant winners and losers elsewhere in Asia.
Oh, absolutely. When a market as massive as China shuts the door on its main supplier for something like scallops, the global market has to rebalance, like instantly.
Where did China turn?
Southeast Asia saw an immediate bump. The total value of seafood trade from Southeast Asia to China went up by about $191 million between September 2023 and August 2024. China had to find replacements for that nearly 3% of its global aquatic imports that Japan used to provide.
So which countries in Southeast Asia benefited the most? Who was ready to step in?
We saw some clear winners jump in quickly.
Right.
Indonesia, Myanmar, and the Philippines, they saw pretty significant immediate increases in their seafood exports to China. They could fill part of the gap, especially for maybe lower to mid-value seafood.
But you said the growth was uneven.
Very uneven. And this is where it gets interesting. Some really big established players, countries you'd expect to benefit, actually lost ground. It really shows how complex these trade relationships are, especially when it comes to quality control.
Yeah, I found that really counterintuitive. Major exporters like Vietnam and Thailand, they're right there geographically, but their trade volume with China actually went down during this period. Why?
That really highlights how important things like pre-existing trust and, frankly, a good track record on quality control are. China's GACC, the agency that banned Japanese seafood, they already have incredibly strict standards for everyone.
So Vietnam and Thailand had issues before this?
Yes. Vietnamese seafood, for instance, had faced repeated rejections even before the Fukushima issue blew up. There were documented problems with things like using too much polyphosphate, which is a preservative. That led to, I think, 15 Vietnamese companies getting blacklisted by China way back in 2019.
Okay, so there was already friction there.
Definitely. And then you had the lingering effects of the pandemic, which didn't help either.
How did that play into it?
Well, during the height of COVID, China kept reporting finding traces of the virus on packaging from Vietnamese seafood shipments. Whether that was a real risk or not, it severely damaged consumer confidence in China and led to more rejections at the border.
So even with this huge billion-dollar opportunity created by the Japan ban, these older issues, trust, quality control, stuff completely unrelated to radioactivity, meant Vietnam and Thailand couldn't fully jump in and grab that market share.
Exactly. It's a tough lesson in maintaining standards consistently.
Meanwhile, those Japanese scallops, the ones Watanabe Suzan had 100 tons of, they had to find somewhere to go. Did they find some interesting detours?
They did. The scallop market shows how trade finds a way, even if it's indirect. Vietnam, interestingly, became a major alternative market for Japanese scallops.
Wait, Vietnam was importing more Japanese scallops, even with their own export issues to China.
Yeah, it seems counterintuitive again, right? But Vietnam's imports of Japanese scallops shot up massively, a staggering 771% increase from January to September 2024 compared to the whole of 2023.
771%? What's going on there?
The thinking is that Japan found an indirect route. Send the raw or maybe partially processed scallops to Vietnam. Vietnam has processing capacity. They process them there. And then maybe those scallops get re-exported to other markets, possibly even back to China under a different label or to other countries entirely. It spreads the risk away from just one buyer.
Our processing hub strategy makes sense. Did the U.S. take more too?
Yes, the U.S. also increased its direct imports of Japanese scallops pretty significantly by about 23.7%. So new direct markets opened up too.
Okay, and we can't really talk about China finding new seafood sources without mentioning Russia, especially given the current geopolitical climate.
That's the critical overlay here. China's imports of seafood from Russia were already surging. They increased by 50% back in 2022.
Why was that?
Mostly because of Western sanctions on Russia after the invasion of Ukraine. China stepped in as a major buyer. Now, fast forward to the Japan ban. Japan's out of the picture as a competitor in the Chinese market, and then Russia also implements its own temporary ban on Japanese seafood imports in October 2023, kind of reinforcing China's position.
So it clears the path even more for Russian seafood.
Completely. The pathway for Russian seafood to fill that huge demand in China is wide open. This geopolitical alignment means the volume of Russian seafood going to China is almost certainly going up even more. It really shows how sometimes these environmental or health-related trade disputes can be influenced by or even secondary to much bigger political and economic games.
Okay, so we've covered the huge economic hit and the scramble for new markets. Let's pivot now to the root cause. the science, or maybe the dispute over the science. The whole crisis really hangs on this question. What's actually in that treated wastewater, and can Japan's claims of safety really be trusted?
This is absolutely the core of the conflict, the scientific battleground. Japan started releasing this treated wastewater from the Fukushima Daiichi plant back in August 2023. And it's not a quick thing. It's a process expected to take decades.
Why do they have to release it at all? Why not just keep storing it?
Because they were literally running out of space. The plant has these massive storage tanks holding enormous volumes of water that was used to cool the melted reactor cores over the years. Those tanks were getting full, and that itself was becoming an ongoing operational risk at the site. Release was seen as the necessary next step, however controversial.
And the risk, the contamination risk, comes from the sheer mix of stuff in that water, right? It's not just one thing.
Exactly. The water contains something like 621 different radioactive isotopes. But we need to focus on the ones that cause the most concern, the ones driving the debate.
Okay, which ones are those?
Well, the big one, the centerpiece of the whole controversy, is tritium.
Why tritium?
Because it's an isotope of hydrogen, so it becomes part of the water molecule itself. That means the main filtering system they use, the Advanced Liquid Processing System, or ALPS, can't fully remove it.
So it stays in the water that gets released?
Yes, but the plan relies on massive dilution. Before dilution, the concentration of tritium in those storage tanks reached about 860 terabecquerels. That sounds like a huge number, and it is a significant amount of radioactive material in total.
Terabecquerels. Can you break that down? What does 860 TBq actually mean in simple terms?
Okay, so a becquerel BQ is just a measure of radioactivity, one atom decaying per second. A terabecquerel is a trillion becquerels, so 1,000 billion decays per second. It's a measure of the rate of radioactivity.
So 860 trillion decays per second in the tanks.
Roughly, yeah. Now, tritium itself emits low-energy beta particles, so it's generally considered less hazardous if it's outside the body. But having that much of it concentrated in the tanks is why they needed this very long, slow-release plan over decades.
And the dilution is key.
Absolutely key. TEPCO's whole argument is based on diluting this water with massive amounts of seawater before release, aiming for a final discharge concentration way below 1,500 BQs per liter.
How does that compare to, say, safety standards?
That 1,500 BQ per liter target is actually about 7 times lower than the World Health Organization's standard for drinking water. So Japan's argument is, we're diluting it so much, it's far safer than even international drinking water guidelines.
Okay, so the argument is dilution makes tritium safe. But critics weren't just worried about tritium, were they? They pointed to other, nastier isotopes.
Exactly, and this is where the counterargument gets strong. That brings us to things like strontium-90. Greenpeace, among others, really hammered on this one.
Why strontium-90?
Because chemically, it behaves a lot like calcium. So if you ingest it, your body takes it up and it accumulates in your bones. That significantly raises the long-term risk for things like leukemia or bone cancer. It's a much more biologically hazardous radionuclide than tritium.
And was it getting through the ALPS filter too?
Well, this is the critical point. TEPCO's own data, released publicly, show that in some batches of water after it went through ALPS processing, the levels of strontium-90 were still way over the regulatory limits, anywhere from 100 to sometimes 20,000 times the standard before the planned final dilution step.
20,000 times, even after filtering?
In some cases, yes, according to their data. Now, the plan was always to dilute that massively afterwards. But seeing those kinds of numbers in the treated water understandably fuels skepticism and fear globally. Even if the dilution is perfect, people look at that raw data and worry.
That's a huge range, 100 to 20,000 times. Are there other risky elements people are worried about?
Oh, yes. There's a whole cocktail of them. Carbon-14 is another concern. It has a very long half-life, thousands of years, and it can get incorporated into organic molecules and potentially damage DNA. Then you have cesium-137, which can accumulate in soft tissues and potentially cause sarcomas. Iodine-129, which specifically targets the thyroid gland and is linked to thyroid cancer. Cobalt-60.
Okay.
The list goes on. It's the sheer number and variety of these potentially long-lasting contaminants that forms the scientific basis for the caution, regardless of how much you dilute it.
And this wasn't just, activist groups raising alarms. Didn't scientists in the U.S. also voice concerns?
They did. The National Association of Marine Laboratories, a U.S.-based group, actually formally opposed Japan's release plan.
What was their main argument?
Their core worry was about the lack of good long-term data on bioaccumulation. They argue that even if you dilute these radioactive chemicals down to levels that seem safe in the water itself, they can still build up in the food chain over time.
How does that work?
Well, tiny organisms like plankton absorb some radioactivity. Small fish eat lots of plankton, concentrating it. Bigger fish eat lots of smaller fish, concentrating it further. So, species higher up the food chain, like the tuna and scallops Japan exports, could end up with much higher concentrations than the surrounding water over decades. That long-term ecological impact, they argued, was a major unknown.
Okay, so Japan is facing this huge wall of skepticism, both political and scientific. They desperately needed some kind of international seal of approval for their claim that releasing the water was safe, that it was much safer than international standards.
And that's where the IAEA comes in, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the UN's nuclear watchdog. Their role here was absolutely critical. They're seen as the global authority on nuclear safety standards.
And they reviewed Japan's plan.
Yes, they conducted a pretty thorough, multi-year review of the whole plan. The ALPS system, the dilution process, the monitoring.
And what did the IAEA conclude in their big report in July 2023?
Their final, comprehensive report basically gave Japan the green light. They concluded that the plan was consistent with established international safety standards. And crucially, they stated that the planned discharges, given the dilution and monitoring, would have a negligible radiological impact on people and the environment.
That sounds like a pretty strong endorsement.
It was. It provided Japan with this essential layer of objective international validation. It was vital for them, politically and diplomatically, to be able to point to the IAEA report and say, look, the global experts agree with us.
It still wasn't enough to stop China from imposing the total ban just a month later.
Correct. Which tells you that this wasn't just about the science anymore. China clearly wasn't satisfied with just the IAEA's report.
What did they want?
They seemed to be leveraging the genuine public health fears within China, and they demanded more concrete, verifiable guarantees directly from Japan. This led to over 10 rounds of really intensive, highly technical negotiations, not just between Japan and China, but involving international organizations too.
So it moved beyond, is it safe, to how can we be sure it's safe?
Exactly. It wasn't just about discussing tritium levels anymore. It became a complex diplomatic process about monitoring, about verification, and ultimately about China wanting more direct oversight.
Which brings us to that breakthrough agreement in September 2024, the one that finally cracked the ban open, at least partially. What was the key thing Japan had to give up or agree to?
The absolute core of the September 20th agreement was about transparency and control, shifting from assertion to demonstration. Japan basically agreed to institutionalize international oversight in a way that went beyond the initial IAEA framework.
Or so.
They committed to setting up a long-term international monitoring arrangement. And here's the crucial part. They agreed to allow stakeholders, explicitly including China, to conduct their own independent sampling and monitoring, not just observing Japan's monitoring, but doing their own tests on the water and the marine environment.
Wow, that's a big concession, giving China direct access to do its own checks.
It's a monumental shift. It gives Beijing a way to verify the safety claims firsthand on an ongoing basis. They don't have to rely solely on TEPCO's data or even just the IAEA's initial assessment anymore. Japan also offered some additional monitoring measures on top of that.
So it moves from Japan saying, trust us, the IAEA says it's fine, to, okay, come and check for yourselves.
That's essentially it. It's about demonstrating safety under independent bilateral scrutiny. And China's side of the bargain, they indicated they would gradually resume imports of Japanese seafood, provided it meets Chinese regulatory standards.
Ah, the fine print meets Chinese standards.
Right. Japan's prime minister tried to frame it as just applying China's general criteria that apply to all imports. But the practical effect is a heightened, verifiable safety requirement aimed squarely, and maybe exclusively in practice, at Japanese products.
And that new system, that requirement, is what led directly to that new piece of paper for our Hokkaido fishermen, the certificate.
Absolutely. The operational reality changed instantly. Now, Japanese fish processing facilities have to be registered with the Chinese authorities. And for every single batch they want to export, they have to provide an inspection certificate that guarantees it's been tested for radioactive substances according to China's rules.
So it creates a paper trail, proof of testing for every shipment. What are these Chinese standards they refer to, like those GBT codes?
Yeah, GBT 11413 times 2015 and GBT 16145 2022 were mentioned. Think of those as China's very specific, very detailed rule book for import safety and quality.
What do they actually cover?
They essentially lay out the exact scientific methods that must be used and the maximum permissible limits for detecting various contaminants. That could be heavy metals, bacteria, residues, and in this specific case, of course, radioactive substances. By forcing Japanese exporters to test and certify according to these specific Chinese standards, Beijing ensures compliance is totally measurable against their own legal framework. It gives them a clear scientific basis to reject any future shipment if it doesn't meet their precise criteria.
But even with this agreement, China's foreign ministry made it clear they weren't suddenly okay with the water release itself, right?
That's a vital piece of context. China used this agreement to get the scientific oversight they wanted, while carefully maintaining their political opposition to the underlying act of discharging the water.
So the ban lifting is conditional?
Very conditional, phased, and potentially reversible. Beijing explicitly stated they remain opposed to the discharge itself and stressed the need for ongoing technical consultations. They basically reserve the right to slam the door shut again if their independent sampling finds anything concerning.
Okay, let's zoom out again for a second. We talked about the economics earlier. Seafood is actually less than 1% of Japan's total exports. The hit to the overall GDP was tiny, like 0.04%. If the direct economic damage to Japan was relatively small overall, why did China pick this particular fight? Why the seafood ban?
This is where you really see the shift from pure economics to broader strategy. That tiny GDP impact tells you this wasn't primarily about crippling Japan's economy. It seems much more likely that the ban was influenced by wider political tensions. The wastewater issue provided a very convenient, very visible, and emotionally charged pressure point.
It taps into that deep-seated public fear of nuclear contamination, which is really hard for any government to argue against, even with scientific reports.
Precisely. It's potent. It allowed China to exert pressure in the context of all the other friction points, things like the ongoing dispute over the Senkaku Islands, or Japan siding with the U.S. on restricting exports of chip-making technology to China. The seafood ban was relatively easy for China to implement quickly through the GACC, and it had this huge immediate psychological impact, both inside China and internationally. It made the Japanese government look diplomatically isolated and vulnerable on this issue.
Now, Japan has fought these kinds of bans before, right? Didn't they take South Korea to the WTO over a similar issue?
They did, and that case is really instructive. It probably influenced their decision to negotiate directly with China this time, rather than going straight to litigation.
What happened with South Korea?
South Korea banned seafood imports from Fukushima and 7 nearby prefectures way back in 2013, right after the initial disaster. In 2015, Japan filed a formal complaint with the World Trade Organization under the SPS agreement, that's the one covering sanitary and phytosanitary measures, basically health and safety rules for trade.
And did Japan win?
Initially, yes. In 2018, a WTO panel ruled in Japan's favor. They basically said South Korea's ban was discriminatory and wasn't based on sufficient scientific evidence, especially given Japan's own testing.
Okay, so precedent set.
Not quite. Here's the twist. South Korea appealed, and their argument on appeal was clever. They argued that Japan hadn't provided enough data to prove the absence of risk, particularly concerning radionuclides that weren't being routinely measured at the time. And in 2019, the WTO appellate body overturned the initial ruling and sided with South Korea.
Wow. So Japan lost the appeal.
They did. That history really shows how tricky and unpredictable it is to fight these cases at the WTO when they involve perceived food safety risks and scientific uncertainty. Proving a negative, proving something is definitively safe for decades to come, is incredibly hard in that legal context.
So that loss likely made them hesitant to immediately file a WTO case against China this time.
You have to assume it weighed heavily on their minds. Japan certainly considered it. The U.S. ambassador even publicly suggested America would support Japan in a WTO dispute against China. But the South Korea precedent showed that even with the IAEA report backing them up, winning a legal challenge wasn't guaranteed and could even backfire again. So the diplomatic route, hashing out this agreement for scientific cooperation and independent sampling, however tough, was probably seen as the more pragmatic, less risky path for Japan in the end.
Okay, so we've got the economic impact, the scientific arguments, the diplomatic deal, but that leaves the final piece, which feels like the most fragile. Consumer trust. Science can say something is safe, diplomats can sign agreements, but getting people to actually believe it and buy the product again, that's different.
It's the absolute core perception problem. and maybe the hardest to fix. Remember, this whole water release went ahead, even though local fishing groups in Fukushima were strongly against it.
Right, they felt betrayed.
Deeply. The Fukushima Prefectural Federation of Fisheries Cooperative Associations put out statements saying that TEPSO and the government broke their promise, the promise not to proceed without the understanding of the parties involved. When the very people catching the fish feel ignored and betrayed, how can they possibly reassure the public? Their credibility is shot.
And that broken trust, it makes the whole market incredibly jumpy, doesn't it? Vulnerable to the slightest hint of a problem.
Totally. People in the industry, local politicians, they talked about it like sitting on a market bomb. They knew that if TEPCO messed up even slightly, an operational glitch, a mistake in the sampling data, or God forbid, another cover-up attempt, which, let's be honest, TEPCO has a history of.
Yeah, that history doesn't help.
Not at all. Any hint of trouble, and the reputational damage would just explode all over again. The fear is that the mere idea of nuclear radiation, regardless of the actual measured levels, is so powerful that consumers worldwide will just reflexively choose any other seafood option. That guarantees prices crash and demand vanishes, especially locally.
So, faced with this huge perception crisis, what was Japan's strategy domestically? They basically had to try and build a firewall of trust at home, right? Almost like a national marketing campaign based on solidarity.
That's exactly what happened. We saw this massive wave of domestic support, a real counter-trend within Japan. People across the country started actively trying to support the Fukushima fisheries. There was a noticeable surge in demand for jobanmano, that's the traditional name for fish, caught off the coasts of Fukushima and the neighboring Ibaraki prefecture.
Trying to stabilize things from the inside out.
Right, an attempt to show confidence from within, hoping it radiates outwards.
Can you give some examples of what this eat and shear rally looked like on the ground?
The efforts were very public, very visible. You had customers deliberately placing mail orders for jobanmano, sometimes paying more than usual just to show support. Prefectural government cafeterias made a point of serving Fukushima fish regularly, a symbolic gesture, and then the Tokyo metropolitan government launched a big campaign.
What did Tokyo do?
Between October and December 2023, they ran a 3-month eat and shear subsidy campaign.
A subsidy? How did that work? Was it aimed at specific products?
Yes. It specifically targeted the kinds of high-priced seafood that were hit hardest by the China export, banned things like lobster, premium whitefish. The mechanism usually involved giving discounts or rebates directly to restaurants and retailers if they prominently featured jobanmano on their menus or shelves.
So 2 goals there. Keep prices from crashing for the fishermen and get Tokyo residents, the biggest consumer market in Japan, used to seeing and eating this fish again, normalizing it.
Exactly. Providing a financial cushion while also making a very public statement encouraging consumption.
And then the culinary world got involved too, bringing in that high-end credibility.
That was a really powerful move, culturally speaking. Some really world-renowned chefs, particularly kaiseki cuisine masters in Kyoto. These guys are at the absolute pinnacle of Japanese food artistry. They deliberately developed new, high-profile menus featuring Fukushima fish as the main ingredient.
What was the message there?
Their stated goal was explicitly to fight the negative reputation, to ease safety concerns by showing their absolute confidence in the product's quality and safety. The thinking is, if a chef revered for their meticulousness and quality standards is proudly serving this fish, then it must be unquestionably safe and delicious. That kind of endorsement carries huge weight.
So did all this domestic support, the subsidies, the chefs, did it actually work? Did it stabilize prices?
For a while it seemed to. Auction prices back in the Fukushima region markets did hold steady. In some cases, they were even higher than before the ban, really driven by that national wave of support.
But it sounds like there's coming.
There is, because everyone involved knew this goodwill was fragile and probably temporary. Officials on the ground, like Katsuya Goto from the Prefectural Fisheries Agency, kept warning about it.
Yeah.
He basically said any mishap in the seawater discharges in its sampling results would easily hurt the reputation all over again.
One bad test result could undo everything.
Instantly. And experts watching the situation cautioned that this kind of support, driven mainly by patriotism and sympathy, isn't a sustainable business model in the long run. The industry needs reliable foreign markets and structural stability, not just temporary domestic goodwill.
Okay, so if the goal is long-term sustainable trade, Japan can't just rely on domestic cheerleading. They have to absolutely nail the execution of that new monitoring agreement with China.
Precisely. Sustained effort, total transparency, and rigorous science are the only way forward now. It's non-negotiable. Japan has to maintain almost radical transparency and stick meticulously to those strict monitoring standards they agreed to in September 2024. That includes actively facilitating the independent sampling by China and other stakeholders. The whole diplomatic deal hangs on TEPCO and the government keeping a completely clean, verifiable record from here on out.
And from the other side, what are the importing countries, especially China, doing to ensure safety and sustainability for themselves? What's their focus now?
China is basically doubling down on tightening its own scientific defenses. They're emphasizing strengthening their radioactive detection standards, referencing those specific GPT documents we talked about. They're also investing in better scientific models to analyze environmental data and predict potential changes or risks in trade flows. It really underlines that Beijing's approach is all about using verifiable, data-driven science, interpreted through their national standards, as the gatekeeper for market access. It's about control and reinforcing consumer protection on their terms.
And what about those other exporters, the ones in Southeast Asia who maybe picked up some market share while Japan was banned? What's the new challenge for them if they want to keep selling to China?
They need to realize that the bar has been raised permanently. Safety and verifiable quality control are now paramount. Countries in Southeast Asia have to actively follow China's very strict import rules, including meeting those specific radioactive detection standards if requested. They also need to seriously beef up their own internal inspection and quarantine systems.
They can't afford slip-ups like Vietnam had before.
Exactly. They can't afford the kind of persistent quality issues that held Vietnam back. Because China now has even more justification and probably more political will to use any lapse in standards as a reason to control import volumes or reject shipments.
And this pressure, it ultimately lands on the individual companies, right? Demanding much more sophisticated supply chain management.
Absolutely. Corporate responsibility becomes essential for rebuilding any kind of trust. Companies in Japan, but also in Southeast Asia, wanting to export to China, they had to significantly strengthen how they manage their supply chains.
What does that mean in practice?
It means implementing really robust traceability systems, systems that can pinpoint exactly where every single batch of fish was caught. That way, if there's a contamination issue, you can isolate it immediately at the source and prevent wider recalls or bans. It also means companies probably need to invest more in their own R&D for advanced, super-sensitive radioactive detection tech, so they can do their own screening internally, often going beyond the bare minimum regulatory requirements just to reassure buyers and consumers.
Okay, so bringing it back full circle to those Hokkaido scallops that just started moving again, it sounds like the road to a full recovery, getting back to pre-ban levels, is going to be incredibly slow, measured shipment by shipment.
Agonizingly slow, most likely. That first confirmed export after the ban was lifted for Hokkaido was just 6.6 tons of scallops.
6 tons compared to what used to go.
It's symbolic, but it's a tiny, tiny fraction of the multi-billion-dollar flow that existed before. It just confirms that the resumption is tentative, strictly conditional, and being closely watched. Every single shipment now is like a small test case in reestablishing trust.
And Japan still has a lot of diplomatic heavy lifting to do, right? To get the ban lifted for the other regions, too?
Oh, yes. They're continuing to push China diplomatically to lift all the remaining restrictions, especially the bans on those 9 other prefectures that were excluded from the initial Hokkaido deal. And while they're at it, they're still lobbying China to lift that much older, completely unrelated ban on Japanese beef that's been in place since 2001 because of the BSE outbreak back then.
Shows how these trade frictions can linger for decades.
It does. Solving one problem doesn't just wipe the slate clean. These things accumulate.
So the new normal that emerged from this whole crisis, defined by that September agreement, it really seems to be one where verifiable science and radical transparency are now the absolute bedrock of trade stability, at least for sensitive products like this.
I think that's exactly right. The agreement itself was a significant diplomatic achievement, born out of intense technical negotiation. But whether it leads to long-term market stability, that depends entirely on Japan sustaining that transparency, allowing the monitoring, and just slowly, painstakingly rebuilding the consumer trust that got shattered so quickly by fear and geopolitics. This new standard of verifiable safety isn't optional anymore. It's the price of doing business in these sensitive global supply chains.
This deep dive really has laid bare how a decision about managing environmental waste in one region can just explode into a massive international trade crisis. That Chinese ban, It was clearly a severe, painful stress test for Japan's fisheries. It forced them into rapid diversification, and in doing so, it fundamentally reshaped how high-value seafood moves around Asia.
Absolutely.
Right.
And the way it was resolved, or at least partially resolved, points to a critical shift in global trade dynamics. This new agreement, built around international monitoring and independent sampling, proves that increasingly stringent, scientifically verifiable safety standards, often dictated by the importing country, are the non-negotiable price of admission. It wasn't enough for Japan to just claim it was safe. They had to agree to a system where safety could be independently and continuously verified.
So the ultimate takeaway here seems to be that in our interconnected world, a local environmental issue can instantly become a global trade crisis. And maybe more importantly, in today's global economy, things like geopolitical maneuvering, consumer perception, and the ability to provide third-party verification are becoming just as fundamental to market success as the traditional factors of price and quality.